Welcome to Christian Podcast, where we look at the world and, our own lives through a Christian lens.
Hi, everyone. And today, we're diving into a topic that, well, it touches so many families, I think. Navigating generational differences.
Uh-huh. Those tricky waters sometimes. And specifically, we want to look at it through the lens of faith.
Exactly. We've got some really insightful material here, and we're going to focus quite a bit today on one particular article called From Blocked to Blessed, a Singaporean Christian mother's journey through generational conflict, plus some other related stuff, too.
Right, that one. So the mission today really is to dig into these sources. We want to pull out those core principles they offer, especially looking at how faith, how biblical wisdom can actually help bridge these divides, turn that conflict into real connection.
That's the idea, from blocked to blessed. And the sources, they kind of start by painting this picture that feels, well, instantly recognizable, I think, even if the specific setting is Singapore. They show us this reality of generational conflict in families and how it can just create this really painful emotional distance.
Oh, it really hits home with that image they use of Madam Lim, the Christian mother,
Yeah.
opening her WhatsApp and seeing that stark red exclamation mark right next to her daughter Sharon's name.
Ugh, yeah. That digital barrier. But it's more than just tech, right?
Exactly. The source presents it as this powerful symbol,
Yeah.
of a growing chasm between them, that feeling of just being shut out.
It's such a vivid starting point, and the sources are quick to point out this isn't just like one isolated family struggle. One article actually cites data showing that in Singapore, something like 63% of millennials report clashing with their parents.
63%. That's significant.
It really is, and it's over those big life choices, what university course to take, career path, even when or who to marry.
And you mentioned the Singapore context.
Yeah.
The sources really highlight that this tension, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's playing out against this backdrop of a super competitive society.
Hyper competitive.
And an incredibly high living cost, like median home prices over $1 million Singapore dollars.
Yeah, it's intense. And those external pressures, they definitely crank up the heat on those life decisions, don't they?
Absolutely. When the stakes feel that high, economically, socially, different views on how to live your life can just escalate so easily.
And like for Christian parents, like Madam Lim in the story, there's this whole other layer, this wrestling with their faith.
Right. How does that deep biblical understanding of family, like Psalm 127, verse 3, children are a heritage from the Lord, how does that fit?
Yeah, how does it square with a child's more modern view? Like the sources quote her daughter Sharon saying, marriage isn't a mandatory module in life's curriculum.
Wow. That's quite a gap in worldview compared to maybe more traditional faith-based expectations.
It really is. And the sources kind of set this up as the core challenge they're exploring. How does this timeless biblical wisdom actually apply? How does it interact with these rapidly changing social norms and generational viewpoints?
Okay, so that's the problem space. Where do the sources suggest we look for solutions?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. They suggest bridging the gap often starts, maybe surprisingly, not with the child changing, but with an internal shift inside the parent.
Ah,
They identify 3 key spiritual reflections that can sort of initiate this transformation.
all right. Let's unpack the first one then. They talk about self-examination. What does that actually look like here?
Yeah, this is crucial. The sources really encourage parents, in Madam Lim's case, mothers specifically, to look inward, to honestly recall their own past.
Oh, interesting.
So Madam Lim remembered, defying her own father's wishes back in the day. She chose accounting when he wanted her in the family business.
And she saw a connection there, didn't she, between her own youthful choice and her daughter Sharon's dream of sustainable fashion design.
Exactly. That same kind of independent spirit, choosing a path that wasn't necessarily the one laid out for her. And this kind of introspection, it brings this really humbling reminder. It echoes Romans 3.23, right? For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
We've all been there.
Precisely. Recognizing our own past imperfections, the times we made choices that probably worried our parents or caused disagreements, it fosters empathy.
Yeah.
It helps the parent kind of step back and realize, okay, my child is also navigating their own journey. They need space to figure out their calling, just like I did.
So it's less about judgment, more about recognizing that shared human thing of finding your path, but framed by Scripture, by remembering our own shortcomings. That builds empathy.
That's it exactly. And the sources, they connect this self-examination to another deep spiritual reflection, redefining success.
Ah, okay. How so? Especially in that Singapore context you mentioned, which sounds very focused on achievement.
Yeah, exactly. And a really meritocratic culture like Singapore's, success often gets narrowly defined, right? Professional titles, financial status.
The usual suspects.
Right. But the sources bring in this powerful challenge from Jesus himself in Matthew 16.26. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul?
Oof. That puts things in perspective.
Doesn't it? It's a profound reorientation. It challenges the Christian parent to think, okay, what does success really mean? Is it just hitting societal benchmarks? Or is it about faithfulness to God's unique call on my child's life?
So shifting from societal approval to like spiritual faithfulness.
Exactly. And that shift allows both parent and child, ideally, to seek God's will together. It frees them from feeling trapped by those external pressures. It fosters this shared spiritual pursuit that goes way beyond just career timelines or marriage deadlines.
That sounds, well, it sounds like a pretty radical shift for a lot of parents, particularly in that kind of high-pressure environment.
It absolutely is. And moving beyond that internal reflection, the sources then stress the importance of embracing modern times with contextual humility.
Contextual humility. Okay, what does that mean?
Well, think about how fast Singapore has changed. It's transformed incredibly quickly, and that creates completely new realities for the younger generation.
Right, you mentioned the housing prices, but the sources also talk about other things, like a 30% increase in single-person households just since 2010.
Yeah, and whole new career fields, things in tech, creative arts, sustainability, jobs that just didn't really exist in the same way back in the 80s when, say, Madam Lim's generation was starting out.
True. The world looks very different.
So any advice that's rooted only in the values and assumptions of the 1980s, well, it might be well-intentioned, but it might not actually connect with the complexities their kids are facing today.
Right. So contextual humility means?
It means approaching this difference with an understanding that the context has shifted. The sources even use that powerful image from Jesus in Matthew 9.6.
Do not put new wine into old wineskins.
Exactly. The idea is maybe try to see your children's choices, even if they seem really unconventional or totally different from what you expected. Maybe see them not just as rebellion, but maybe as their response to God's call in this current era. It takes humility to acknowledge that God is actively working now in this context, and his plans for this generation might just look different.
And what's really fascinating there, the sources point out how this openness, this willingness to see God working in new ways can actually turn potential conflict into like shared spiritual discovery.
Yes, they give that great example with Sharon and her sustainable fashion.
Oh, yeah.
She explained to her mom how her work actually deeply aligned with the biblical call in Genesis 1.28, to rule over the earth responsibly, stewardship. And Madam Lim apparently had this real aha moment. She realized, wow, maybe God is speaking through my daughter's generation, through their specific passions, their concerns about the world, in ways I just hadn't considered before.
It's like realizing God isn't confined to the paths we understood back then.
Yeah.
And our kids might actually reveal his work to us through their own unique journeys.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that leads right into the third key reflection the sources highlight.
Yeah.
Practical surrender.
Okay, practical surrender. This sounds like where the internal shifts start showing up in actions.
Exactly. A really crucial turning point is realizing that the biblical instruction, like in Ephesians 6.4, to train your children, well, it means guiding them, nurturing their faith and gift.
They're not dictating their entire life path.
Precisely. It involves this conscious act of surrendering control over the specific outcomes you might have envisioned.
And shifting instead.
Through a posture of prayerful support.
How did Madam Lim do that?
The sources give this really concrete example. She actually stopped pressuring Sharon about going to law school. Big sif.
Yeah.
And instead, she started asking things like, how can I pray for your fashion startup this week?
Wow. That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
It's actively supporting the path her daughter felt called to, even if it wasn't her first choice for her.
Right. It's letting go of her plan and supporting God's potential plan.
Yeah.
And it also implies this trust, doesn't it? Trusting that God might be revealing his creation, his plans, differently to the younger generation.
Like that passage in 1 Corinthians 12 about the diversity of gifts.
Yeah.
Maybe across generations, too.
Could be. And the sources say Madam Lim experienced this kind of wonder firsthand. Her daughter Sharon bought a resale HDB flat and intentionally designed it with eco-friendly features and a dedicated prayer corner.
Nice.
And Madam Lim saw that, and she could appreciate how her daughter was integrating faith into her modern life, her home, in this really unique yet totally valid way. It was a different expression of stewarding God's creation.
Okay, so these internal shifts, the self-examination, redefining success based on faithfulness, embracing the present with humility, and then this practical surrender of control for prayerful support. It sounds like these really paved the way for actual reconciliation.
How do the sources say that plays out in, like, day-to-day interactions?
Yeah, they outline specific biblical principles that become like actionable tools for rebuilding that connection. And first and foremost is love is the foundation.
Can't go wrong there.
Yeah.
1 Corinthians 13 kind of love.
Right.
Exactly that. Applying those principles, love is patient, love is kind, it absolutely transforms communication.
How so? Give me an example.
Well, instead of falling into those critical, maybe fear-driven statements like your startup is just going to fail, the shift is towards supportive, faith-filled questions.
Okay.
The source gives the example of Madam Lim starting to ask Sharon things like, so what challenges did you face today, and how can we pray about them together?
That creates a totally different dynamic, doesn't it? Much more open.
It creates space for vulnerability, for mutual sharing. The sources describe how this change allowed Sharon to actually open up more about how she was trying to integrate biblical themes like stewardship into her fashion work. Love builds that trust, you know?
Makes total sense. Communication is huge. What else?
Next, they highlight humility and listening. And they anchor this in James 1:19. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry.
Good reminder for all of us.
Isn't it just? And the sources specifically mention how relevant this is in cultures like Singapore's, where there's sometimes this kiasu mentality, that afraid to lose kind of thing,
Yep.
which can sometimes lead parents, maybe out of concern, to jump in with advice or speak first before they've really heard their child's heart.
So prioritize listening, actually understanding before assuming or advising.
Absolutely essential. And the sources even mention a practical tool Madam Lim used here, the 3-3-3 rule. Ever heard of that?
No.
3 minutes of just like actively listening to her daughter, then 3 minutes for her to share her own heart, and then 3 minutes praying together.
Huh. That's a really tangible framework. Simple, but sounds effective.
Apparently it was. And the sources say it was through this kind of structured listening that Madam Lim finally understood the deeper stuff behind Sharon's resistance to traditional paths. It wasn't just stubbornness, it was fear.
Fear about what?
About financial stability, you know. In such an uncertain field compared to, say, law. And because she listened first, then Madam Lim could offer genuine comfort and reassurance.
Not just generic advice.
Exactly. She could share something like Proverbs 3.5-6, trust in the Lord with all your heart. And it actually landed because it addressed the real fear she'd heard.
That's powerful. Listening leads to targeted encouragement. Okay, love listening. What's the third practical element?
Prayer as the bridge. Really intentionally committing the conflict, the relationship, the future, all of it, to God's will through prayer.
Going beyond just praying about it, maybe.
Yeah, maybe praying through it together. Madam Lim actually took this quite literally. She initiated a prayer walk with Sharon around her design studio.
Wow, okay. A physical act of dedication.
Exactly. A symbolic act of dedicating Sharon's work, their relationship, everything to God.
And what happened?
Well, the sources say that as they prayed together, they found this shared sense of reassurance, particularly focusing on Jeremiah 29:11.
For I know the plans I have for you. That one.
Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Yeah, that one.
Such a comforting verse.
And it became this powerful reminder for both of them, apparently, that God's sovereign plan for their lives, for their relationship, was bigger and better than their own differing expectations or their fears.
So prayer becomes this mutual act of faith, of dependence on God. It strengthens their spiritual connection in a way that just arguing and pressuring never could.
Exactly. It shifts the focus from me versus you to us seeking God together.
So ultimately what the sources are showing us is that when you approach generational conflict through these kinds of spiritual reflections and these biblical practices, when you surrender it to God, it can genuinely transform.
Yeah. It stops being about winning an argument or getting your own way.
It becomes more like, the sources use this phrase, a canvas for his grace.
I like that. And it moves families towards a deeper truth, one that goes beyond just those societal measures of success we talked about.
Right, like Ecclesiastes 3.1 reminds us, he has made everything beautiful in its time.
And the sources apply that here to seeing the beauty of God's unique work unfolding across different generations within the same family. maybe appreciating the beauty in the difference in his timing.
It allows families not just to, coexist or tolerate each other,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe to actually co-glorify him, to discover how God is weaving this unique story, this generational destiny through their combined lives, their different talents, their perspectives.
Yeah. And the source ends with that really lovely image, doesn't it, of Sharon's fashion show, featuring designs inspired by both the Genesis creation story and Singapore's cultural heritage.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's like a convergence of faith and generations and modern life all coming together.
Exactly. The story starts with that painful block, remember? That red exclamation mark on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
But through this whole journey described in the sources, this journey of self-examination, humility, surrender, love, listening, prayer, that block became, as the source puts it, like a comma.
A pause, not an end.
Right, a turning point in a bigger story, a narrative that's ultimately guided by God. It really is a walk of faith, isn't it? Hand in hand with God, that has the power to turn that strife into harmony.
So we've really dug into how these sources, especially that story of Singaporean mother and daughter, show the power of self-reflection, of embracing the times with humility, of surrendering control practically, and then really applying those core biblical principles. Love, listening, and prayer.
Yeah.
All to navigate generational conflict.
It's a compelling picture, moving from feeling blocked to feeling blessed, relationally and spiritually.
And it really shows us that God's work is dynamic, doesn't it? It unfolds uniquely across different generations, and he invites us to actually join him in that process, not fight against it.
Well said. It encourages us to look for his handiwork in places and maybe in people we didn't expect.
Which brings us to a question for you listening right now. How might you apply some of these principles we've talked about? Self-examination, humility, surrender, love, listening, prayer. How might you apply them to navigate differences in your own relationships, trusting God's unique plan as it unfolds across the generations in your life?
Something to reflect on. Thank you for listening. See you next time.